Good afternoon. I'm Dave Apsley. I'm a forester and a natural resources specialist with Ohio State University Extension. Today I'm at Lake Catherine State Nature Preserve in Jackson County, Ohio, and I'd like to introduce you to American elm. American elm is pretty common in Ohio still, but it's not nearly as common as it once was. Dutch elm disease, a fungal disease that was brought into the United States inadvertently, has attacked many mature American elms. And it's not real common to see large American elm like this, but you will pretty often see smaller American elms in low-lying areas similar to where we are today. So how do we identify American elm? Well, first of all, American elm is very similar to its cousin, the red or the slippery elm. It has very similar leaves. These leaves aren't quite mature, so they're going to get quite a bit larger, but they'll get between, keys say 3 to 5 inches in length, but I rarely see them near 5 inches. 3 inches is probably a pretty good average for the leaf length of American elm. Slippery elm, in contrast, will have much larger leaves, and I've seen them much greater than, say, 7 inches in length occasionally, especially if they're growing in the shade. But how do we identify them? Well, first of all, they have somewhat of an egg-shaped shape. They have a very sharp tip. The leaf edge or margin is serrated. Actually, it's what we call doubly serrate because each large tooth has small teeth on it. And then when we look at the base tends to be asymmetrical or somewhat lopsided. It's not quite as obvious because this leaf is not mature, but typically one side will droop down further than the other side. So again, about 3 inches in length, the edge has doubly serrate or is doubly serrate or has teeth that have teeth on them, and then the base is somewhat lopsided. The leaf surface is somewhat dull, but it's not going to be as rough or sandpapery as the slippery elm. Slippery elm feels a lot like sandpaper. You can rub it on your face and it feels like someone took sandpaper to it. This one tends to be a little bit or quite a bit smoother. It can be a little bit scabrous and you may see a little bit of hairiness to it. Twigs are brown and the buds are brown. So there's not much of a contrast when you look at this bud and you compare it to the twig in the color. There's not a whole lot of contrast there. Twig diameter is fairly fine. They tend to be about 1/8 of an inch or so in diameter when you're out here near the tip. Where slippery elm is going to have much more contrast. Twigs are going to be gray, buds are going to be really dark, and the twigs are going to be much more stout again on the slippery elm. So review the twig again, brown twigs and brown buds, not a lot of contrast there, and they're fairly fine. Other things to look for a little bit later in the spring, you're going to find some very unique fruits. They're samaras. They're actually winged. They're only about 3/8 to 1/2 inch in diameter. They'll have a notch in them, and then it'll have this papery wing around a seed in the center. And those will be maturing here in probably the next month or so. As far as bark, the bark is quite a bit different also on this one than the slippery elm. This bark will have distinct layers, and sometimes it's very exaggerated. You'll have very thick bark, very spongy. If you were to hit it or to squeeze it, you're going to feel that it has some give to it. Looks a lot like styrofoam layers, light in color with thinner, dark layers in between. So think of a peanut butter sandwich. Again, spongy, fairly thick at times, light layers with darker layers interspersed. You'll also find a base that's somewhat swollen oftentimes, especially if these are growing in bottomland areas or in swamps. They're going to have a big swollen base to give them a nice stout foundation, so they're going to be much more firm in that very loose soil. They can't put down very deep roots in that situation, so again they tend to want to spread out and they'll have that big swollen or buttress base. And then finally, the shape of this tree, they tend to grow upward, and then instead of having a nice central leader like things like tulip tree or yellow poplar, they tend to want to branch out. Almost looks like all the branches were stuck in a vase, and you get this nice vase-shaped form. That's what made them such great street trees in the past, because if you had one of the trees with a vase-shaped form on each side of the street, you actually had almost like a tunnel down where the road was, and you didn't have a lot of interference with branches. So again, this is American elm. It's still hanging in there in spite of Dutch elm disease, but we don't see near as many large specimen trees as we once did. Thanks so much for your time. and please be sure to take part of your day to enjoy it in the woods.